Hello and welcome to another round of OAuth Happy Hour. I am Aaron Parecki and we have Micah Silverman here as well. Micah has an important update to share. Do you want to tell them about your new work situation?
Yeah, sure. So last Friday was my last day at Okta, and I this week I started at a company called Split. So for this feed, nothing will change, but
Yeah.
I have to still have a list of things to update, profiles and whatnot. I haven't had to update my list 4 years.
Right. Yep. Well, we will still be continuing OAuth Happy Hour, and Micah is still, of course, knowledgeable as always about OAuth things. So, yeah, won't see much changes around here as far as that goes. But I will miss Micah in my day-to-day work. So, looking forward to
Same.
just chatting here every week now.
Yeah, I forgot that we had other channels of communication. I had a moment of panic earlier where I was going to be like, how am I going to talk to Aaron
Right.
now that we're not on the same Slack org?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. What is that SMS or Signal thing? Yeah. Well, anyway, if you are joining us live on YouTube or Twitch or on our website, then feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we will we'll be answering questions from you. Otherwise, we'll just be talking about what's new in the world of OAuth.
Nice.
And yes, you can ask questions. I see a question in the chat already. The question is, can I ask questions? Please do. Drop your questions in the chat, and we will.
You just did.
You just did. Yep. Yeah. So, also welcome OAuth.net viewers. I dropped a link on OAuth.net or an embed there to this stream. So if you are joining us from there, welcome. We do this pretty often, and it's fun. We just talk about OAuth stuff. So we can start with a little bit of news from the OAuth working group. The working group, we've been in the middle of a series of interim meetings. We've been doing one meeting a week for the last couple of weeks. Still have a few more to go, including one more about OAuth 2.1 at the end of this series. And this week's meeting was about the security best current practice. And that is I didn't realize how long the draft had been in progress, but it's been several years now, which is just how these things go. And the meeting was to discuss some of the final changes and last minute things to slip into the best practice. And there was a vote to put it to last call, which means basically get your last comments in. We're ready to push it out the door and stamp it. So I think everybody is excited to get it done and out there and not have it be in progress work anymore. Even though there's always more things you could put into the best practice. It is it's a best practice, which means there's always new things we're learning as a community, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't just actually put a stamp on it. So yeah, that was the
Yeah,
that
I was
was
going to say that is exciting news. And I want to dig into it a little bit. I'm
Mhm.
curious to see what elements of the 2.1 in progress spec have kind of been backported into the BCP.
Right. It's been interesting because the work in OAuth 2.1 was started long after the BCP, but one of the goals of OAuth 2.1 is to incorporate everything in the BCP. It's meant to just consolidate that, so it's not going to have all the same text necessarily, but it's going to end up with the same functionality as you would get if you follow the BCP. And as over the last year, as both of these efforts have been evolving in parallel, there have been some things that we've been working on in specifically the OAuth 2.1 effort that we've had to kind of, I don't want to say backport, but maybe the spec text had been more recently changed in 2.1, even though it's actually a lot of the same people working on both of them. So the intent was always to have the security BCP include those features as well. even if the actual published document didn't necessarily reflect that in parallel, because they have not been published in parallel at all. So the there's a couple of things, but I think the latest draft of the BCP was just published, and we now have a relatively recent draft of OAuth 2.1 as well, and they should be more or less in parallel now. Of course, I still have a bunch of changes to make to 2.1 before the next interim meeting, and with any luck, actually the security BCP should be well into the final publication process by mid next month. So hopefully we have a stable base to work from there now, where we can incorporate the rest. We can make sure that 2.1 is actually incorporating everything in the security BCP now.
That's cool. What would you call out as some of the biggest changes, considering the BCP's been around for a while?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that was recently added to the security BCP was all the stuff around like dropping the implicit flow or officially deprecating the implicit flow. And the most last minute change was actually brought up a couple weeks ago in one of the interim meetings. It was the ISS parameter. We talked about it a couple times. We talked about it when it was first proposed at all. And it's a bit of a trick to understand how that thing works and how it solves the particular problem it solves. And it's only really relevant if an OAuth client is going to be talking to multiple OAuth servers. So, but there is a concrete problem, and this is a concrete solution. It's a relatively simple mechanism. So the consensus of the group was to slip it into the BCP at relatively the last minute, even though it is supposed to be far enough along that it's not changing dramatically anymore. So that was definitely one of the last things to be added into that.
And what is the best current practice as relates to the ISS?
The idea is that if a client is configured to work with multiple authorization servers, if you might have a bunch of sign in with X, Y, and Z buttons in your app, then if you are using a single redirect URL for all of the redirects back, you may not know which server is doing the redirect when you just get a code appearing, right? So the idea is that the server should be adding an ISS response parameter along with the code. So in the redirect, it would include code, state, and ISS, which is the issuer URL of the OAuth server, identifying itself, so that the client can know which server that code is supposed to be validated at or exchanged at. And the other, I'm trying to find the section in the spec about that. It should be in, it turns out ISS is not a good thing to search for because it's just part of a word. Okay, let me share my screen. This is the section that talks about it. So if a client interacts with more than one authorization server, you have to defend against mix-up attacks, either by using the ISS parameter or basically using the ISS parameter embedded somewhere else. So if you get an ID token that contains the ISS parameter, you can use that as well. But mix-up attacks are one of the more confusing class of attacks, just because it takes a lot of pieces to, like, a lot of players involved to be able to describe how to pull off an attack. So this was one of the ones that you did, Micah. The authorization code injection is a type of mix-up attack.
Right.
And I mean, that was a 18-minute long video edited down, and there's a lot of preconditions or prerequisites in order to even understand how the attack is being pulled off. So this is there's a whole bunch of different kinds of mix-up attacks, and one of them is the authorization server mix-up attack. And yeah, you can read about it in the draft here. So
and it sounds like people there's an opportunity. It seems like it gives you a lot of runway now. If you conform to the BCP, then you're kind of OAuth 2.1 ready.
Yeah, that was actually that was you commenting that in the chat. um, so yeah, this is a good question. So if we have a working OAuth 2 plus OIDC server, is there a reason to switch to OAuth 2.1, or is it okay to wait for a longer time because it works? And yeah, Micah commented, if you implement the elements of the security BCP now, it'll be ready for 2.1. And that's exactly it, is that if you do have a working OAuth 2.0 plus OIDC server, it is still possible that you might still be vulnerable to a couple of attacks. And that's because these are things that have been discovered recently or may not have been documented well in previous versions of the spec. And you also may have already worked and solved those attacks in some other way yourself. But the idea with the security BCP as well as OAuth 2.1 is to sort of make it more likely that someone building this for the first time will come out with a secure and correct implementation at the beginning. So I would say, there isn't really a switch to OAuth 2.1. That's not really how it's going to work. It's going to be making your system more secure. And by doing that, you will then become OAuth 2.1 compliant. And you can start doing that right now, which is always a good idea to secure your system by following all the recommendations in the security BCP.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point because, that's why we're not talking about OAuth 3 or something else. This is really, for the most part, a paring down and a simplification and a kind of aggregation of extensions and things that are out there. So there's not, to my understanding, there's not a ton of new stuff, maybe no new stuff in 2.1.
There's not supposed to be any new stuff in 2.1. I think one of the questions we're going to have, one of the discussions we have to have as a group is whether to include the ISS parameter in 2.1 because it was created after we started the effort of 2.1, although it is a relatively minor piece and it solves a very concrete problem. So we're going to have that discussion as a group. But there isn't new functionality, right? So other than potentially that part, which again is only applicable if your client talks to multiple authorization servers.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge to make that call because if I'm a vendor and I have, OAuth 2 as a service, I can, if you're not going to include ISS, I can be OAuth 2.1 compliant by maybe taking away certain things, like not making the implicit flow available anymore. But if ISS is included in the spec, now I have to add some new code,
right? Yeah,
to my service.
Well, and that I think actually specifically for vendors, it's going to be a particular problem because we, as a vendor with a commercial product providing an OAuth server, you don't know how customers are going to be using it. And the ISS parameter is specifically needed if a client is using multiple authorization servers, which only one of which may be provided by that particular vendor. So you don't even know if your customers are necessarily using it with multiple or not.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the going to be one of the challenges as a group of figuring out how to deal with that. There's a question here. Can the state parameter be used to identify the issuer by somehow linking it with the button the user clicked to sign in instead of using the ISS parameter? I believe that is I believe that is possible. Let me look at the sentence again. This is the sentence that's in question here. The requirement is actually to defend against mix-up attacks, not to require the ISS parameter, right? So as a client, if you're interacting with more than one server, you have to defend against mix-up attacks. And to do that, you can use the ISS parameter as defined by this extension, or an alternative countermeasure based on the ISS value in the authorization response, such as ISS in an ID token, or, and this is the one that's interesting, in JARM responses, which is a whole new extension, which is basically it's a the authorization server will return a JSON web token instead of an authorization code to pack all that in there. This is an interesting point, though, about using the state parameter. I'm going to have to think about it. I might have to ask some people. I think it may only work if you use a JOT encoded state, because otherwise the state value can just be tampered with as well. So I'm going to have to double check on that, because that would be an interesting one to include in this list as well. But the other way to do it is using distinct redirect URLs, which is probably the easier option. And that is basically you just make a redirect URL for each authorization server. So you would have exampleapp.com/redirect/Okta, exampleapp.com/redirect/auth0 if you're talking to both authorization servers, right? And then when you get the redirect back, you know which one it's for because it's identified by the URL, which is also registered as the redirect URL. Is this document the OAuth 2 best security best current practice draft 13? We are up to 18 now, but that is the correct document. You should be able to navigate to the latest draft from 13 if you find it. This is the new link. But you can always go to oauth.net/2 and you can find it there. So you can go to oauth.net. There's us. And then down here, there's the security best current practice, which will link you to the latest version. There's a little trick with these IETF URLs, which is if you take off the version number, it'll redirect you to the latest version. So there's no version number there, but then we get taken to -18. So that updates to 19 when that's published.
It's a nice IETF hack.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. A couple other good questions coming in the chat. And let me just make sure I'm looking at the Twitch chat as well. Can you tell where is the intersection of OAuth 2.1 and OpenID Connect 1? Is there only code cover them both? So OpenID Connect has not yet had the discussion about what to do about changes coming in OAuth 2.1. Or rather, it's not changes, it's more restrictions, more limits. So OpenID Connect went and defined a whole bunch of stuff on top of OAuth, right? One of the, frankly, worst parts, I think, is all the hybrid response modes that are, in my opinion, mostly unnecessary. I do understand the desire to have a simplified version of the flow for ID tokens, where if you only need an ID token, you can use the implicit flow in OpenID Connect to get only an ID token back in the front channel. I still don't think it's a perfect solution. It still has the problem of the OAuth server doesn't ever know if the information in the ID token made it to the client or it was leaked. But again, that, like I always say, that a threat of a leaked ID token is much less than the threat of a leaked access token. So it's a, your choice as to whether you decide that it's okay if ID tokens are leaking. But the other response modes, the hybrid response modes, are combinations of returning an ID token in the front channel and an access token in the front channel, or ID token in the front channel, access token in the back channel, or whatever, combinations of those. If for some reason you want to get an access token back in the front channel and also then later in the back channel, which is one of the ones which honestly makes no sense to me. I feel like somebody just enumerated all the possible combinations of response types because you can, because it seems like a thing to do. But in my opinion, which is no way anything official, I think that the only response modes we should see in OpenID Connect in the future are code, where you get both ID token and access token in the back channel, or ID token, which gives you only the ID token in the front channel and nothing else, no access token. And you don't need any hybrid ones, and it's just simplified that way. That's what I would like to see in OpenID Connect. And basically you get that if you just take off the token response type. All the options in the spec containing the token response type. So that's what I would like to see, but I don't know if that discussion has yet happened. I don't follow the OpenID work as closely as the OAuth work because there's just a lot. There's just a lot there. So,
Is there any effort in a different working group or that you're aware of to kind of rein back in the functionality of OpenID Connect and just make it all OAuth?
kind of. So, not specifically make it all OAuth, but um, the financial API subgroup within OpenID Foundation, they are essentially profiling OpenID Connect, which is, of course, on top of OAuth, subsetting all of that into a more secure profile of the whole thing. So they are removing, like officially saying, don't use the implicit flow, don't use any of that, don't use, lop all these optional things out of the OpenID Connect spec. And they're even going so far as to say, don't use client secrets. Client secrets as a shared secret aren't safe enough for the financial industry. Instead, all client authentication has to be certificate based, which of course is an option in the OAuth spec, but almost nobody uses it because it's just harder to use from a client's perspective. But it's always been there as an option, and OpenID Connect doesn't require it either. But the financial API profile is saying that's the only way client authentication happens. No more client secret. Like that's not safe. We want the auditability and traceability of certificate-based authentication.
And is there a kind of a formalized registration process for that kind of interaction? The way there is, when right now, if you go and register with a provider, you get issued a client ID and a client secret. Is there a similar sort of or some sort of process that by which you would get issued a certificate?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what that looks.
Certificate validated.
Yeah, I don't actually know what that looks like in practice. It would have to be, in order for it to be the most secure, it would have to be something where you create a private key, and then tell it your public key, and prove that you control the private key.
Right.
So that otherwise, if you could download the private key, then that's actually not that much better than a shared secret, because then
Right.
you don't. It can't be baked into hardware at that point, right? Like the ideal security model here is the private key lives in a hardware module and literally cannot be extracted from the electronics. And that's the most secure option, in which case even you as the developer can't extract the private key. All you can do is sign stuff with it. So that's how YubiKeys work, and WebAuthn and Face ID and all that. It's all hardware-based certificates. So the idea is to use that to authenticate the client, because that's so much stronger than a shared secret or even a certificate that you would download.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
Neat.
Yep. Another good question here. When integrating with any OAuth providers, is it recommended to use the OAuth provider's client libraries or create our own API requests for getting the code and token, and why? That's a good question. I have conflicting opinions about it myself, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it too, Micah. If the provider has followed the best practices and standards of OAuth, then you don't need the client library that the provider has, because you should be able to use any generic OAuth library or OpenID Connect library, or just write it from scratch. And that is, I think there's some benefits to that, in that it's easier for you to tell what you're doing, easier for you to know that your code is working correctly, assuming you know what to look for when you're writing an OAuth client. And fewer dependencies means you don't have to worry about necessarily bringing in whatever dependencies the provider's library might also be including. The flip side is, if there are peculiarities about how the provider's OAuth system works, those might be abstracted away nicely by their own library that they provide. So you might have to worry about it a lot less and just sort of read their API docs about how to interface with their code, and it might work smoother. But I'm curious your thoughts on that, Micah.
Yeah, I have similar kind of conflicted thoughts about it. Some of it depends on how deep you want to go. It's a little like Inception because as an example, the technology that I know the best is Spring Security, and Spring Security has built-in support for OAuth. So any OAuth provider you can just drop into Spring Security. You don't need Okta's Spring integration at all. But you get some nice efficiencies if you do use Okta's Spring integration. So on the one hand, you'll write code faster and have to think about it less. If you're an Okta customer. On the other hand, if you then switch to some other provider, you have to tear some stuff out. Whereas if you used Spring's built-in OAuth facility, you would just be changing some configuration variables, and that would be it. So it's kind of like, how much vendor lock-in do you want? It's like a calculus between, assuming all things being equal, like it's you trust the vendor and whatever, vendor lock-in versus, or ease of use versus vendor lock-in, those kind of considerations. And then if you're not using Spring at all, or you're not using some framework at all, and you're, writing your own thing, then it's, are you going to use an SDK or not? I think if, at least to my mind, if I'm not using a big framework like Spring Security or .NET, if I'm doing some other thing, then I'm more likely to just make API calls directly than use an SDK, because the bang for the buck starts to get lessened. But if I already have this big framework, if I've already made this big commitment to .NET or Spring or Node.js or whatever, then there's some benefits to using these libraries that the different vendors have.
Yeah, I think there's
a
a
long-winded answer, but
well, you got to another point, which I think I don't know if I didn't say it as well as you did. The Spring Security has an OAuth framework in it, and there's a lot of those kinds of frameworks that are similar, where Ruby has the OmniAuth library, where it's in a generic OAuth client, and then there's usually little provider-specific overrides for things. And if your web framework that you're using has the ability, has its own built-in OAuth framework, where it expects to be able to plug into arbitrary providers, I think that's probably the best option to use, because you don't have to write that code, and you don't have to do anything special for the vendor. So that's sort of I think the best of both worlds. But that's slightly different than the question of, do we use the vendor's SDK or do we write the code from scratch, right? It's kind of like a middle ground. And I think that is a good middle ground there. Same is true with, I'm involved in I help out with a project called Vouch Proxy. And the idea is that it's a little authentication layer that sits in your web server, like Nginx, and will redirect you out to an OAuth provider to log in, and then only authenticated requests can get through to the backend app. And that project also has a similar thing, where it's got a generic OAuth client, generic OpenID Connect client, and then a couple of provider-specific overrides for things like GitHub, which isn't, you have to, it's the user info endpoint that you have to do specifically for different OAuth providers that aren't OpenID Connect. And integrating, if you want to add support for X OAuth server into that, it's going to be the best option to write no code and just do it in config using the existing code in that project. So I think that's always the best option. And that kind of, that's this point here. As an app developer with only a mild understanding of OAuth, presumably, would it be better to use the battle-tested.NET libraries than to write your own libraries? Yeah. So if you do have generic libraries available to you, like generic OAuth and OpenID Connect libraries available to you, I would definitely go for that over writing your own code for it. But I might still go for those over the provider's SDKs, because again, it's probably going to be better maintained than the provider's SDKs, frankly, because it's going to be used by a lot more different people using different systems. So the chances of it being more up to date are higher, because it's just going to have a wider audience, right?
I have a question that may be tangentially related to this conversation that you may have an opinion on, and that is this past week I did a little presentation for a hack reactor cohort that my sister happens to be involved in, and they've learned React, they've learned JavaScript, and they got to the point now where they wanted to start doing something with Auth. They've built a bunch of applications, and I did this demo for them where I showed them using the Okta CLI to go and create an Okta account and to build Auth into their React app. And the thing that was interesting about it is that OAuth or OpenID Connect, they're all, brand new developers, probably don't know much about Auth in general yet. But in about 5 minutes, they had Auth integrated into their apps that they'd been working on. So one of the things I said to them is that this is kind of a double-edged sword here. Like it's made Auth look really easy, which is great. Now you can prove that you can log into your app and your app knows you're in an authenticated state. But at some point, you're going to have to know a little bit more about the mechanism behind this. So, I'm just curious about, like, for developers, even experienced developers, but not experienced with Auth, how deep do you think they need to go with learning the mechanism of OAuth as opposed to maybe just using a library that just kind of makes it all work?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Using the libraries is great because there's they're battle tested. There's a lot of eyeballs on it. They hopefully have good test suites and all that. So you're less likely to make mistakes by doing that than doing it all from scratch by hand. But I do also think that it's important to have a little bit of an understanding about what's going on under the hood, so that one, you can know you know how to evaluate the libraries when you're looking at them, because definitely not all libraries are created equally, and it's useful to know what to look for to tell if a library is going to be a good option and secure and has solved X, Y, and Z problems that you might care about. Definitely a good way to get going, get started quick. But yeah, I do think it's worth having some understanding of what's going on under the hood, as annoying as that might sound. it's it's just such a fundamental, the security of your app is such a fundamental part of it, and without that, it's bad, right? And the embarrassing thing about the whole industry is that how many leaks of data have there been because somebody left a MongoDB database exposed to the internet with no authentication, which is like, yeah, you shouldn't have to think about
open.
Yeah, S3 bucket database, whatever, and you shouldn't have to worry about authentication, but you also can't ignore it. And if you just pretend like it's not a problem and then put your MongoDB on the internet, it becomes a problem very quickly. And you have to at least know enough to know not to do that, right? And so yeah, you have to learn something about it at some point. And I think the balance there is, yeah, not everybody's going to be a security expert. Not everybody should be a security expert, but you should be able to know a little bit about what's going on under the hood, just enough to know what to look for. Like, this is the same. I have this problem too with where, I want to learn too many things, and I want to know how to create CPUs, right? Like, I'm not a chip designer. I don't know anything about hardware. I can solder a little bit, and I can make some LEDs light up when I plug them into batteries. I am definitely not a chip designer, but I would like to know, and I do know just enough about that space in general to know things like what is even remotely possible or what's just not possible, right? So I think having that little layer of understanding of, like, well, I know that if I ask it to do this thing, it's just not going to work, means I can avoid a lot of problems and headaches by not trying to go down a path that's just going to be frustrating anyway, right?
Yeah, in the example that I gave, I left the session with scheduling a follow-up session just because I felt a little bit queasy, like I'd, given an axe to a toddler or something.
Mm.
Because now, now they were like solved, and maybe, what's happening behind the scenes with it. So, and at least in the context of Okta, the good thing is that there's so many options with Okta. This follow up session is going to be focused on OAuth 2 and the authorization code flow. This is I kind of got excited that there are 20 people that maybe will never even know what the implicit flow is because they're just starting right off the right way.
Yeah, yeah. But that's another example of like the implicit flow. I feel like I still have to mention it in workshops when I'm teaching about OAuth because people will encounter it, and it's
Right.
useful to know specifically why it's not a good idea because that helps you, talk about it with your coworkers or understand
Right.
why the other flow is more secure instead of just sort of following the motions. Getting some interesting questions here. So this one I'm going to give to you, Micah. Are you, because I don't know what Microsoft Graph Toolkit is, but are you more opposed to frameworks like Microsoft Graph Toolkit where I get an OAuth OIDC with an element in my web page and client secret, or is it okay to use it or to use Google's API? Yeah, I haven't actually used Microsoft Toolkit. Have you seen that?
I haven't either.
Okay.
But I mean, it does dovetail a little bit on what we were just talking about. I'm a little dubious of products that purport to solve all the problems for me without me having to know a little something about
Mm-hmm.
it, about the mechanism. I think a good case in point actually with OAuth 2, and I've certainly been guilty of this myself in the context of demonstrations or proof of concepts. Like how many clients actually validate the state?
Mm.
It's left up to
Mm-hmm.
the application client. I bet not. I bet a shockingly low percentage. And to dovetail on what we were talking about a little earlier, if you are using a battle tested library or SDK, I know for sure that Okta's JavaScript SDKs validate the state, and probably most libraries out there, hopefully all of them do now. But it's something that's left up to the application. So if you're kind of rolling your own, um,
Yeah,
and
it's
and
easy
you
to skip
don't, you've
that
kind of
step.
left off an important piece. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, a couple more questions from the chat. Refresh token exchange with unreliable client where the network cannot remain stable, like native app. User logout can happen and data sharing third party can be interrupted. Is that a question? Is a problem? Yes. This is one of the reasons that some people did not want to require refresh token rotation as a requirement for public clients, because public clients tend to be things that are like mobile apps on unreliable internet connections. The idea of rotating client, not client secret refresh token, means if you use the refresh token and the network request fails, but it made it to the OAuth server, but the response didn't come back, it means that the you're kind of stuck, right? Because you didn't get the new refresh token, the old one stopped working. So that's why there's an option for deciding whether you want to do refresh token rotation or not. And without rotating them, that's not a problem at all because the refresh token will just keep working and the client can try again. Um, and that's a lot less likely to be a problem than in a server-to-server app or in an app on a desktop browser, somewhat because they're um, tend to be on more reliable internet connections, usually on a computer compared to a phone.
And I guess in the
Um,
scenario you described, that you just have to re-authenticate. You have no credentials anymore. Your
yeah,
access token is expired. You don't have a valid refresh token. So from a user experience perspective, you just have to re-authenticate,
yeah, and it's
which
not
might be
great.
jarring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Not a good experience having to do that. Um, Here's another question. Is there any back-channel logout notification planned for OAuth that'll be helpful for single sign-out use cases? Only way to do it now is to bring in the whole OIDC. I don't think that's really in the scope of OAuth, which is why it's in OpenID Connect, because OAuth is not a single sign-on protocol. You can use it to make one, but by itself it isn't. And you have to do a bunch more stuff in order to effectively use it as a single sign-on protocol, which a bunch of that stuff is in OpenID Connect. And I don't think we're going to see any push to bring it into OAuth core, because as soon as you need to do that, you need to do a bunch of other stuff, which is already in OpenID Connect. Yeah.
It's kind of one of the reasons OIDC ended up existing, right? Like companies, Facebook, looking at you, were misusing OAuth for those sorts of purposes. It was never intended for that.
Yeah, and like, of course, OIDC is built on top of OAuth, so it is a bunch of the same concepts apply and all that, but it is not by itself. OAuth by itself is not a single sign-on protocol. It's a toolkit you can use to build a single sign-on protocol. So if you wanted to bring in single sign-out use cases into OAuth, you would have to start bringing in a bunch of other things, and then it starts looking an awful lot like OpenID Connect. Maybe you could get around the idea of using ID tokens. Maybe you don't need that at all in order to do it, maybe, but you have to think through that too. The other thing is, like, because OAuth was created as a delegated authorization protocol, like that was the goal, right? Of I want to let this app access my data in some API. It's the classic use case was a Twitter app where you download a third-party Twitter client and then you want to let it post tweets to your account, or you want to give Zoom access to your calendar so that it can add events to your calendar. That's delegated access. That's not single sign-on. And delegated access is the thing that OAuth is doing. And it just so happens that the two look very similar, and you can kind of turn it into a single sign-on protocol if you do enough extra stuff with it. There was another question from earlier. In a federated user model where legacy groups and roles are already well established, and putting this auth info for users as claims and access tokens, any ideas on best practices? Yeah, we definitely see that a lot. The bringing information about user accounts into access tokens. So if you're using structured access tokens like JSON Web Tokens, like Okta's tokens are, and many other systems, adding your own custom claims from your own directories or user databases, or whatever you want to call it, either through like directory integration or hooks, where you can do it sort of on the fly in line. Those are all definitely doable. And I would say the thing to keep in mind is when you are using JSON Web Tokens for access tokens, the data inside the access token is not encrypted. And that means it is visible to the user and visible to app developers. So if you start putting too much internal information into your access tokens, you can end up leaking implementation details about your system, right? So it's definitely possible that it's okay to do it. It's possible to make sure that you're still secure, but just remember that a user will always be able to see what's inside the token if they get an access token, they'll be able to see what you've put into it. So it's just something to keep in mind, but definitely is possible. This was about the refresh token question. What's the solution and best practices? The takeaway, sorry, I guess that wasn't clear. The takeaway is you don't have to turn on refresh token rotation. It's okay to use the same refresh token repeatedly, in which case you don't have the problem described about getting the user logged out if the request fails. And it's usually safe to avoid refresh token rotation on mobile clients, because the odds of a refresh token leaking out of a mobile app are very low. There's very few ways for that to be stolen. Whereas in a single page app in a browser, there's a lot more ways a refresh token can be leaked. So that's where you want refresh token rotation probably more often. And so thankfully also, while it's true that desktop computers or laptops are on Wi-Fi too and whatever, I think it's more likely to encounter network issues on a mobile phone compared to on a computer, because like the mobile phone even is going to switch between Wi-Fi and LTE all the time, or the cell signal all the time, and even that in the middle of that transition you can lose network requests. Whereas a desktop computer tends to be more stable on its internet. So yeah, the takeaway is you don't have to turn on rotation, so you can avoid that problem completely. And otherwise, if you do want to turn on rotation, you will have that problem. And yes, it is just a problem.
And in the scenario you're describing where there isn't token rotation, if whatever you're using the token for, if that never completes or fails, or the connection is interrupted, you just use the same refresh token and try again. So, your user may never be aware that there was an interrupted connection or anything, because your app is just going to retry.
Yep, exactly. Hello, fellow nerds. Okay, another question. Is the device flow compatible with OAuth 2.1? Yes. So again, because OAuth 2.1 isn't anything actually new, it is just sort of putting some limits on OAuth 2.0. The device flow is extending OAuth 2.0 in actually a pretty significantly different way than most of the other flows work. So the device flow I don't think there has to be any changes to how the device flow works for it to be considered OAuth 2.1. I should probably double check that at some point, go through a list of what the device flow actually entails, other than the sort of high level mechanics of it that I talk about all the time. But it would be like those clients are considered public clients because you can't ship a secret into an Apple TV app, for example. But there aren't any new restrictions on public clients that OAuth 2.1 is doing, so I don't think that even matters. The nice thing about the device flow is that it just isn't the implicit flow or authorization code flow at all, so you don't even have to get into the world of what about the hybrid response modes, blah, blah, blah. So it's just a totally different thing, and I think that it doesn't need any changes in order for it to sort of, you could just say, oh yeah, actually it extends 2.1, and I think everything would work fine. But I should actually double check that. Should we use the client ID as a form of identification of the requesting app from the perspective of a consuming app or resource server from the JSON Web Token access token? Yes, and terminology thing here. The term app is unfortunately used by a lot of different things to mean a lot of different things. So the client developer of a mobile app will call their thing an app, and the developer of a backend resource server will probably also call their thing an app. So when you're asking these questions about OAuth, it is, it's more specific to use the OAuth terminology for, which you've done mostly here. So the client ID identifies the requesting client from the perspective of the resource server. And that's exactly what the client ID is there for. So in a JSON Web Token access token, there will be a claim in there that includes the client ID of the app that requested the token. That is one of the registered claims that you'll find in the access token. And its purpose is to say, this access token was issued to this client, so that the resource server can know which client specifically is making the request if it needs to know that for some reason. The only thing to keep in mind here is that public clients obviously can't authenticate. That's the definition of a public client, which means for a public client, it is technically possible for someone to impersonate a public client. So if you have logic that switches based off of the client ID and says like, only my website can run this API operation. I've got some internal API thing that I only want my website, my main website to run. And if you're basing it off of the client ID, you can only actually trust that check if the client is a confidential client and has used a client secret or some sort of client authentication to get that access token. Whereas, so for public clients like a mobile app, if you base authorization decisions off of the client ID, it's not 100% sure or certain, right? So if you say only my mobile app can make this API request, which something that people want to do all the time, right? You want to lock down your API so that only your mobile apps can request data from it. You can't really do that. Like, you just can't. There isn't a way to do that. Because if somebody really wanted to, they could just mimic what your mobile app is doing, mimic the OAuth flow that your mobile app is doing, and get the access token and then use it. And you can't stop it. So that's true with any public client, even outside of the OAuth world. It's just not something that you can't lock down an API to your mobile app because there is no way to authenticate that application. So yes, you can use the client ID claim and an access token to base other decisions off of, but know that it's only 100% trusted if it's a confidential client. Otherwise, use it as a hint, but don't rely on the security of that value. Great questions, though.
So what's on deck for the working group, and when's our next OAuth happy hour?
Yeah. So the next meeting is next week, and this is at events.oauth.net. And on Monday is the next virtual intro meeting. Oh, this will be a fun one. This is going to be, so identity in browser. This is actually somebody from, I believe it's from Google, wanting to get the browser more involved in OAuth exchanges. Because right now, OAuth exchanges they live inside of a browser, but the browser doesn't really know that it's happening, for example, right? The browser just sees some redirects and things in the URL. We are using browsers without browsers being aware of what's going on in that flow. And there's some interest in getting the browser more deeply involved in the transaction so that it actually knows what's happening and can facilitate it in some way. So this document is there's, I think, almost nothing in here. But the idea, this is just a starting point. It's identity use cases in the browser. So the idea for this document is to document use cases of what you would want the browser to be involved with in the flows. So I think, yeah, this is just a outline right now. The idea is, it's probably worth reading this, but it's basically describing the scope of what this collection of use cases is. Here's how to contribute to it. Here's a template for describing a use case. There is one use case in here already. It is OpenID Connect redirect based sign-in via form post. And it describes what it wants the browser to do, but this looks like a stub also. So yeah, there's some to-do stuff. So anyway, it should be an interesting meeting.
Some really interesting potential there to, once the browser is involved at a low level, you get the possibility of a public client not being so public.
Yeah, there's that. There's the ability to tap into the hardware security modules in computers or in phones. There is the ability to do like account chooser UIs or gather consent differently, because it doesn't have to just be it doesn't have to be a redirect anymore necessarily. It could be done some other way in the browser Chrome. So lots of interesting options there. And that's the kind of things that we want to capture in that document and then see what browser vendors are interested in building.
Very cool.
Yeah. Let's see. We have like a few more minutes and there's a bunch more questions in here, but otherwise we will have to push these till next time. But let's see. What's the essence of deprecating the implicit flow in the BCP and OAuth 2.1? It's the main reason to avoid issuing access tokens into the user agent. Not exactly. And this is going to take more than 2 minutes to describe, but this is the whole concept of front channel versus back channel. It's not that we don't want access tokens in the browser. It's that we don't want to issue access tokens via the front channel. And I'm going to have to just sort of punt that on to go watch some other videos that we've got here on this channel, or come back next week and I can do a whole rant about it. I do have a video on this channel about, it's probably almost 2 years old now, but it's what's going on with the implicit flow. And we talk about that issue in there in that video as well. But yeah, it's specifically the use of the front channel that's the problem. I'm glad you are enjoying Okta's OAuth happy hour. I don't know about other happy hours related to other technologies, but it'd be fun to do some cross promotion with anybody else who's doing that kind of thing. Can you touch on access token types for different clients, public versus confidential? I'm assuming these terms are standard OAuth terminology. Yeah, public clients and confidential clients are OAuth terminology. Access token types don't really differ between the two clients. That's not really a distinction that's usually made. Access token types would be JSON Web Tokens versus reference tokens, and or bearer tokens versus proof of possession tokens. And they aren't, client type isn't necessarily something that you would switch off of in order to decide which token type to use. Usually you will just pick a token type and use it for everything. There are .NET community meetings on YouTube. That's awesome. Okay, cool. I think we're gonna end here. Thank you for all the questions, and I appreciate you all joining. Subscribe here on Twitch or YouTube if you are watching it on either platform. Come back next week, and you know how to find these. Oktadev.events, we post them all there, and we will see you again later. Bye.
See you next time.